An 11-year-old boy gets slapped in front of a room full of fighters just for saying, "My dad's a black belt." But what Coach Riker didn't know was that the boy's father wasn't just any black belt, he was Keanu Reeves. Now, with a storm brewing in the gym, will Keanu teach this coach a lesson he'll never forget? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The gym was a far cry from the sleek, polished facilities seen on TV. Located in a rough corner of the city, tucked behind abandoned warehouses, it had the kind of character that only years of sweat, blood, and grit could create. The mats were stained, some areas worn down to the canvas, while others bore the scuffs of hard-fought battles. The walls were adorned with motivational posters, their vibrant colors now dulled with age and the passing of time. "Fight for respect," one read, its bold letters faded. "Discipline over everything," another echoed. But the words seemed to hang in the air, almost forgotten by the fighters on the floor. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered every now and then, casting long, jagged shadows across the gym. They buzzed as they struggled to stay on, amplifying the tension that always seemed to permeate the air. Fighters moved in practiced rhythm, working through drills, their bodies cutting through the stale air, their movements sharp and precise. But the sound of the heavy bags absorbing the punishment was the loudest noise, punctuated only by the sharp slap of gloves against skin or the occasional shout from Coach Riker as he barked corrections. Near the edge of the mat stood a quiet figure, watching with intense focus. Ethan, an 11-year-old boy, had been attending these sessions for a few weeks now. He didn't participate much, preferring to stay on the sidelines, observing rather than engaging. His gaze was sharp, not just soaking in the techniques, but studying the movements, the way each fighter adjusted their stance, how their body shifted with every punch, every block. His eyes moved from one fighter to the next, tracing their every step, his face serious. Though he stood among the other students, Ethan wasn't quite like them. He didn't have the air of cockiness or arrogance that many of the older kids in the gym displayed. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, especially not to the coach. He was here to learn, quietly, intensely, and without fanfare. He never spoke about his father, though everyone could sense there was something different about him. Ethan carried himself with a quiet strength that didn't scream for attention. He was a kid, but there was a maturity to him that set him apart from the others. The other students didn't know that Ethan's father was Keanu Reeves, the legendary actor and former martial artist. It wasn't something Ethan volunteered in conversation, and no one ever asked. To him, his father's fame didn't matter. What mattered were the lessons Keanu had taught him: discipline, respect, and the power of stillness over force. His father had shown him how to control his body and mind, to fight with the power of patience rather than brute strength. It wasn't a flashy style, the kind of thing that made headlines or viral videos. Instead, Keanu had instilled in Ethan the kind of calm that came from true mastery. A mastery over oneself, over one's emotions, over one's movements. While other kids in the gym seemed to think fighting was about showing off or proving they could take a hit, Ethan understood that it was much more than that. It was about control. It was about knowing when to strike, but more importantly, knowing when not to. Ethan was patient. While other kids sparred, pushing themselves to the limit, Ethan studied. He took mental notes on everything. The way Malik, one of the more experienced fighters, threw his jabs with calculated precision. How Diego, full of energy but lacking control, often left himself open after an attack. And then there was Coach Riker, whose presence alone could dominate a room. Riker was tall and broad, with a square jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from stone. His eyes were sharp, always scanning the room, looking for flaws. The kind of person who made you feel like every mistake you made was a direct challenge to his authority. When Riker spoke, the gym fell silent. The tension palpable. His voice was low but commanding, demanding respect at every turn. He didn't tolerate weakness, and the students under his care had learned that quickly. But Ethan didn't mind the silence. It didn't faze him the way it seemed to affect the others. He had spent his whole life in the shadow of greatness, yet he didn't feel the need to prove anything. There was power in silence, in simply observing. And so he stood on the sidelines, watching as Riker moved through the class, barking commands and showing off his brutal version of discipline. Despite all the noise, the chaos of training, and the constant hum of the gym, Ethan remained a still figure, his eyes tracking every move, every punch, every kick. He wasn't like the others who shouted and called for attention. He understood the value of quiet observation. His father had taught him that. Keanu had always said that the loudest noise wasn't always the most important one. The silence, the moments of stillness, held the true power. But it was also clear to Ethan that Riker didn't quite understand that. The coach's methods were more about brute force than finesse, more about intimidation than about teaching. And Ethan, even at his young age, could see that. It was a way of training that required subjugation, not respect. The thought nagged at him, but he didn't speak out. This was Riker's gym, after all. Ethan's role was to learn, not challenge the philosophy of the man who ran the place. Yet, every now and then, when Riker would make an offhand comment or bark an order that felt more like a demand for respect than a genuine lesson, Ethan's mind would wander back to what his father had taught him. Keanu never raised his voice, never made demands. Instead, he would simply wait, let his actions speak louder than any words could. He believed in teaching through understanding, not fear. That was something Ethan held on to as he continued to watch the fighters in the gym. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for clarity, for insight into how to perfect his craft. But he could already see the cracks in Riker's methods, the kind of cracks that would eventually cause the foundation to crumble. The gym was alive with tension, the sound of heavy bags thudding against the wall, fighters moving through drills. But in the corner of the room stood Ethan, an 11-year-old boy, quietly observing. His focus was unwavering as he absorbed every movement, every technique. His father, Keanu Reeves, had taught him that strength wasn't about force but control, patience, and respect. Ethan, though young, had already learned these lessons deeply. Coach Riker, a towering man with a commanding presence, patrolled the gym, barking orders at his students, making examples of those who hesitated. He thrived on intimidation, believing fear would drive respect. The gym, under his leadership, was a place where strength meant domination, not teaching. Ethan, however, didn't fit in this world. While the other students looked for validation through brute force, Ethan's quiet intensity stood apart. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to learn. Riker noticed Ethan standing still, not engaging in the way he expected. His patience worn thin, he stormed over. "What are you doing standing there?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "I'm observing," Ethan replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "Observing? We don't do that here. Either train or get out of the way." The other students waited, their attention snapping to Ethan. Riker's words hung in the air like a threat, but Ethan stood firm, his silence speaking volumes. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't here to fight Riker or anyone else. He simply knew, deep down, that his path to learning didn't have to be like this. Coach Riker moved through the gym with the kind of presence that demanded attention. His steps were heavy, his eyes sharp, scanning the room with a critical intensity. He was in his 40s, but his build was still imposing, hardened by years of brutal training. His face was lined, not just with age, but with the wear of a life spent demanding more from others than most could give. As he walked between the training pairs, his gaze lingered on the students, looking for weakness, looking for any sign of hesitation or failure. "Diego," he barked at one of the fighters, a young man with an impressive frame. "You've got that elbow high again. This is supposed to be tight. You leave it open like that, you're dead already." The students froze at his words, every pair of eyes turning to watch. Riker didn't just correct, he humiliated. breaking down his students in the hope of rebuilding them into fighters. But what it often built was fear, not respect. His coaching style was direct, to say the least. Riker didn't bother with niceties or encouragement. His words were sharp, his demeanor unforgiving. If a fighter couldn't take the pressure, then they didn't belong in his gym. And Riker made sure everyone knew that. There was no room for weakness, no space for those who couldn't take the hard-nosed approach he believed in. For him, martial arts was about pushing people to their limits, using intimidation to force respect. It wasn't about understanding, technique, or mastery. It was about showing that he was the one in charge. The gym was filled with the sounds of punches landing on bags, the steady rhythm of feet shuffling on the mats, and Riker's harsh voice cutting through it all. His eyes fell on Ethan, standing quietly on the side, as he had done for the past few weeks. Riker noticed the boy hadn't yet stepped in, hadn't yet joined the drills like the others. His eyes narrowed. "Ethan!" Riker called, his voice laced with impatience. "You've been watching for weeks now. It's time to stop observing and start participating." Ethan's body tensed slightly, but he didn't move. His mind was still processing the technique, the counter Riker had demonstrated earlier. He wasn't confident enough yet to execute it perfectly. But Riker didn't wait for confirmation. "I said." "Get on the mat," Riker ordered, his tone sharp and final. Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the strap of his gym bag. He glanced briefly at the fighters practicing on the mats, at the speed and intensity with which they moved, and then back at Riker. Ethan knew his technique wasn't perfect, knew he needed more practice, but Riker had no patience for hesitation. This was a gym, not a playground, and the expectation was clear: sink or swim. Riker didn't tolerate uncertainty. He wasn't a coach who allowed time for self-doubt. To him, that was weakness. You either did it right or you failed. There was no in-between. And Ethan, standing quietly on the sidelines, hadn't yet proved that he was worthy of the respect Riker demanded from his fighters. Coach Riker moved through the gym, his presence filling the space with an air of authority. His gaze was sharp, constantly evaluating his students. Riker didn't just push for technique, he pushed for dominance. His style was about breaking his students down and rebuilding them through fear. His words were sharp, often harsh, always demanding respect. "Diego," he snapped, eyeing a young fighter with a seemingly perfect guard. "That elbow's too high. This isn't a dance class." Diego flinched, adjusting immediately. The gym went quiet, the students already accustomed to Riker's demanding nature. For him, there was no room for failure. Weakness was met with correction, sometimes brutal, always swift. The gym was filled with the sounds of punches landing on bags, feet shuffling across the mat, and Riker's voice cutting through it all. His presence was a force, a constant reminder that respect wasn't something given, it was taken. Riker didn't tolerate hesitation, and it was clear from the way he moved through the gym that no one in his gym was ever allowed to remain uncertain for long. Ethan stood silently on the sidelines, observing it all. He wasn't like the others. There was no cockiness or swagger in him. He was quiet, focused, trying to learn. But Riker's eyes landed on him. The boy had been standing at the edge of the gym for weeks now, always observing, never stepping forward. It wasn't the way things were done in this gym. "Ethan!" Riker's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. "You've been standing around long enough. Get on the mat." Ethan hesitated. He had been watching, learning, but he wasn't ready yet. He didn't feel confident enough with the counter technique. His father had taught him, Keanu had taught him, to wait for the right moment, to observe first. But here, in Riker's gym, there was no time for hesitation. Riker wasn't interested in why Ethan wasn't ready. He was only interested in pushing the boy to perform. Ethan's gaze flickered to the fighters on the mat, then back to Riker. The coach's face was stone cold, expectant. Ethan swallowed, his hands tightening around the strap of his gym bag. There was no backing down now. Riker was watching, waiting for him to make a move. Ethan stepped onto the mat, his body stiff with nerves, but he kept his focus. He wasn't the kind to act impulsively. He'd been taught to think before he moved, but here, that kind of thinking felt like hesitation. Riker didn't have time for that. "Malik, give him a real attack," Riker barked. Malik, a skilled and confident fighter, nodded and stepped forward. His eyes were calm as he squared off against Ethan, but there was no softness in his stance. Ethan's mind raced. He knew what he needed to do. The counter move his father had taught him was simple: pivot and sweep. It wasn't about brute force, it was about redirection. But as Malik advanced, throwing a jab toward Ethan's head, his body hesitated. He knew he should pivot, but the movement didn't come naturally. His foot shifted just slightly, off balance, and the move fell apart before it even began. Malik's jab whizzed past him, harmless but still a reminder that Ethan wasn't in control. The gym, silent just moments before, now buzzed with murmurs. Ethan's hesitation was too obvious to miss. A few students exchanged glances, and some couldn't help but chuckle quietly. Riker crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've been here 3 weeks and still can't execute a basic counter." Ethan's face flushed. The sting of Riker's words hit harder than the punch would have. He wanted to defend himself, explain that he was still learning, but the words didn't come. Instead, he lowered his gaze, avoiding the coach's intense scrutiny. "Again," Riker commanded. "No more excuses. This time, do it right." Malik, ever the professional, stepped back into position, but this time there was no encouragement in his stance, only a quiet understanding that the pressure was on. Ethan felt it too, that pressure pushing him forward. He didn't want to disappoint again, but the doubt creeping into his mind made the next step seem even harder. Riker's eyes never left him, his silence heavy with expectation. Ethan knew he couldn't afford to fail again, not in front of all these eyes. The gym seemed to grow colder, the weight of the coach's dominance pressing in on him. But Ethan knew something that Riker didn't. He had something more to prove than just to the coach. He had to prove to himself that he could do this. Riker's eyes burned with frustration as he watched Ethan hesitate. The gym had gone quiet, every student silently awaiting the boy's next move. Ethan had been observing for weeks now, but it was clear Riker had lost patience. This wasn't a place for spectators. It was a place for fighters. "Ethan," Riker snapped, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've been standing around long enough. Get on the mat. Now." Ethan swallowed, heart racing. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't confident in his counter technique, not yet, but he knew Riker wouldn't care. It didn't matter that he was still learning. Riker wanted results, now. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, moving slowly but steadily toward the center of the mat. Riker's eyes narrowed as he barked an order. "Malik, give him a real attack. Let's see if he can keep up." Malik, experienced and calm, nodded and stepped forward, ready to demonstrate. He launched a jab toward Ethan's face, slow enough for him to react, but fast enough to test his skills. Ethan had practiced the counter his father had taught him, but in this moment, the movements felt foreign, rushed. He tried to pivot, but his foot slid off balance, and the counter fell apart. Malik's jab missed by a fraction, but the hesitation was too obvious. Riker's face twisted into a scowl. "Pathetic," he barked. "You've been here for weeks and can't even execute a basic counter? Get your head in the game." Ethan's face flushed with humiliation. The gym was silent, but the sting of Riker's words cut deep. The other students exchanged uncomfortable glances, some of them snickering, others averting their eyes. Ethan stood frozen, feeling the weight of the failure pressing down on him. "Again," Riker ordered, his voice flat with impatience. "I want to see it done right this time." Malik, now looking more serious, stepped back into position. Ethan, still shaking, nodded slightly. He had to do this. There was no other choice. But as he tried again, his movements felt even more awkward, unsure of himself. The technique was still out of reach. Another failure. Riker's eyes darkened. "You can't even do a simple technique, and you're wasting everyone's time," Riker spat. The harshness in his tone made Ethan's chest tighten. Ethan's throat felt dry. I've been learning," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear, but Riker wasn't listening. "What did you learn, huh?" Riker sneered. "That your movie star dad can teach you a thing or two?" He stepped forward, a dark smile spreading across his face. "Maybe your dad's some backyard martial artist who thinks he can teach real fighting, but we do things differently here." Ethan's heart dropped. He hadn't expected Riker to attack his father's credibility, but now the coach had gone too far. This wasn't just about the counter. It was about dismissing everything his father had taught him. Riker's glare never wavered as he towered over Ethan. The boy stood still, his face burning with humiliation. Riker's words were sharper than any physical blow. "You think your dad is some kind of martial arts legend?" Riker sneered. "He's a movie star, kid, a black belt from a Hollywood movie set. This isn't some pretend fight scene." The gym was thick with tension. Some students averted their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances, but all of them felt the weight of Riker's harsh words. Ethan's body tensed as his mind scrambled for a way to defend his father. But Riker wasn't interested in a defense. He wanted control, and Ethan's hesitation was the perfect opportunity to break him. Riker stepped closer. "Your father isn't here to save you. You want respect? You'll earn it here, or you'll leave. That's how it works in this gym." Ethan clenched his fists at his sides. His father wasn't a movie star. Keanu had taught him respect, control, and patience, but none of that mattered here. In Riker's world, there was no room for the quiet strength his father had taught him. Riker's patience snapped. "Enough talk," he growled, raising his hand. Before Ethan could react, Riker slapped him hard across the face. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through the gym. Ethan's head jerked to the side, and for a moment everything stood still. The pain was immediate, but the sting of humiliation was far worse. The room fell silent. Ethan could feel the eyes of the other students on him, some uncomfortable, others suppressing nervous chuckles. The slap wasn't just physical. It was a public shaming that made Ethan feel small, exposed. Riker stood over him, waiting for a response. Ethan's body shook, but he didn't say a word. He slowly raised his hand to his cheek, the pain searing through him. The gym felt colder, emptier. He hadn't expected this. He had always been taught to stand tall, to hold his own, but now he felt completely vulnerable, stripped of all the confidence his father had instilled in him. Ethan's eyes dropped to the mat. Without a word, he backed away, his heart heavy with the weight of failure. The class resumed, but the air was thick with discomfort. Riker had proven his point, but Ethan's spirit hadn't broken. Not yet. The gym buzzed with uncomfortable murmurs as Ethan slowly retreated, his face still stinging from the slap. His eyes remained cast down, but his mind was racing. The room was silent except for the occasional sound of fists hitting bags and feet shuffling across the worn mats. The humiliation was suffocating, but Ethan refused to let it break him. He couldn't. Riker's dominance was evident in the way he walked through the gym, as though he owned every inch of it. His voice boomed as he barked commands, but no one dared to challenge him. The gym was his kingdom, and today Ethan had been the unfortunate target of his cruelty. As Ethan backed up to the side of the room, he saw a few of the other students glance at him, some with pity, others with a hint of embarrassment, but none of them spoke up. In Riker's gym, silence was compliance. The message was clear. Don't challenge the coach, don't question his methods. Ethan stood still, his body rigid, refusing to let the shame consume him. He wasn't the first to be humiliated by Riker, and he wouldn't be the last. But for a brief moment, as he felt the sting of Riker's slap, It seemed like he might never be able to recover from this. He had come here to learn, to grow, but this wasn't how he'd imagined it. He wasn't here to fight for respect through humiliation. He was here to learn through understanding, through patience. But in this gym, patience didn't exist, only aggression. Riker's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Malik, work with Diego," he commanded, as if nothing had happened. The class continued, but Ethan was no longer a part of it, not in the way he had been before. The sting of the slap still burned on his cheek, but something inside him stirred. He couldn't let Riker win. He couldn't let this gym destroy the lessons his father had given him. The weight of the room, the whispers, and the judgment all pressed in on him. But Ethan didn't let it show. He wouldn't show weakness. Not here. Not now. He lifted his head slightly, meeting Malik's eyes across the room. Malik's expression was unreadable, but there was a brief flicker of understanding in his gaze. Ethan nodded once, silently, before turning his attention back to the class. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. He would find a way to prove himself, even if it meant facing Riker again. Ethan stepped outside, his cheek still stinging from Riker's slap. The quiet industrial street outside the gym felt miles away from the tension inside. He stood, his phone in hand, unsure whether to call his father. He didn't want to burden him, didn't want to show weakness, but the weight of the moment was too much. His finger hovered over Keanu's name, and after a moment of hesitation, he hit the call button. The phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity, until his father's familiar voice answered. "Hey, Ethan, everything okay?" Ethan's heart raced as the words tumbled out. "Dad, I don't know. Riker slapped me." There was a brief pause on the other end. Keanu's voice was calm, understanding. "What happened?" "I messed up in front of the class. I wasn't fast enough. And Riker, he slapped me." Keanu's voice remained steady, his concern evident. "Are you okay?" Ethan wiped his eyes, trying to steady his breath. I don't know if I can go back in there." Keanu's response was firm but gentle. "You don't have to go back if you're not ready. But listen, Ethan, respect can't be forced. It has to be earned. And if someone takes it from you, that's their problem, not yours." Ethan absorbed his father's words, the weight lifting off his chest a little. True strength isn't in fighting back with aggression. It's in handling it with grace. You have more strength than you know. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'll wait outside. I'm not sure I'm ready to go back yet." "I'll be there soon, Ethan. You're not alone in this." After hanging up, Ethan stood in the quiet street, feeling a little lighter. His father's calm reassured him. He didn't have to react with anger. He could choose to rise above it. And with that thought, for the first time since the slap, he felt a sense of peace. Ethan's phone clicked off, the weight of his father's words still settling in his chest. Standing there in the cool air, he felt the tension in his body start to ease. Keanu had a way of making everything seem more manageable, even when it felt like the world was against him. He stood there for a few moments longer, unsure whether he should go back into the gym or wait for Keanu to arrive. But in that quiet space, the reality of what had happened started to sink in. Riker's slap, his words, they were meant to break him, to prove that his philosophy of patience and control didn't have a place in this gym. But Ethan had learned enough from his father to know that Riker's aggression came from weakness, not strength. Taking a deep breath, Ethan looked at the gym door. The thought of walking back in, facing the students and Riker, felt impossible. But Keanu's words echoed in his mind. True strength isn't in fighting back with force, but with grace. Ethan wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense, but he could stand firm in his beliefs. He wasn't going to let Riker's actions define him. Keanu's voice came back to him, steady and reassuring. Respect isn't something you take, It's something you earn, and no one can take it from you unless you let them. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of calm amidst the storm. His father hadn't told him to fight back, hadn't urged him to return to the gym and make Riker pay. Instead, he'd reminded Ethan that his true strength was in how he responded, how he handled the pain and humiliation with dignity. Ethan exhaled slowly, finding clarity in his father's wisdom. He wasn't alone. He had his own strength, the strength his father had taught him, and that was enough. He turned toward the parking lot, ready to wait for Keanu, but more importantly, ready to face whatever came next with a quiet confidence. The quiet hum of traffic echoed in the distance, but Ethan barely noticed it. The cold evening air wrapped around him, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. Sitting on the curb outside the gym, his legs tucked beneath him, he finally felt a sense of peace after the storm of emotions he had been wrestling with. His father's words had been like a lifeline, pulling him out of the confusion and self-doubt that had been weighing him down. Keanu had spoken with such calm authority, reminding him of the strength within himself, the strength he had learned from years of discipline and self-control. Ethan wasn't just the son of a movie star. He was his own person, with his own path to follow. The slap, the harsh words from Riker, they were just obstacles in his journey, not the end of it. His father had taught him that true strength wasn't in responding to aggression with more aggression, but in responding with composure, grace, and inner peace. Looking at the gym entrance one last time, Ethan realized he was no longer afraid. Riker's cruelty couldn't define him. He had a choice now, and he would make it his own. He could walk back into that gym, not to prove anything to Riker or anyone else, but to prove to himself that he could endure, that he could rise above the humiliation. The weight of fear had lifted, replaced with something stronger, an unshakable sense of self. As he sat there, his phone buzzing briefly in his pocket, Ethan knew Keanu was on his way. He wasn't alone anymore, but more than that, he had already gained something invaluable. His father's wisdom, his own strength. He could face what was ahead, not with fists or rage, but with the calm confidence that came from within. The sound of tires crunching on gravel reached his ears, and Ethan turned his head to see Keanu's truck pulling into the parking lot. The headlights illuminated the space, casting long shadows against the gym's walls. Ethan's heart gave a slight jolt, a mix of relief and gratitude. He didn't need his father to solve this for him, but just having him there, a steady presence, made all the difference. Keanu stepped out of the truck, his movements slow but purposeful, radiating that quiet strength that Ethan had always admired. His father's face was calm, steady, but there was warmth in his eyes as he walked toward him. "Hey, kid," Keanu greeted, his voice steady and gentle as always. "You good?" Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of the moment start to lift. His chest was no longer tight with anxiety. Keanu had a way of making everything feel manageable, of making him feel capable even when he was at his lowest. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before answering, but it was easier now. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice stronger than he expected. "I'm okay." Keanu's smile was small but reassuring. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the touch grounding him. "Good," he said simply. "Let's go inside, huh?" "I'm with you." Ethan glanced back at the gym doors, the place that had felt like a battlefield just moments ago. Now as he looked at it, he felt something else. A quiet confidence. He wasn't walking into the gym to prove anything. He wasn't walking in to challenge Riker or anyone else. He was walking in to face the next challenge, armed with the knowledge that respect wasn't something that could be forced, but something that came from within. He nodded, feeling the last of his hesitation fade away. He wasn't the same boy who had stepped outside just a few minutes ago. He was stronger now, and with that thought, he followed his father into the gym, ready to face whatever came next. knowing he could handle it with dignity, just as his father had taught him. The door to the gym swung open with a soft creak, and the noise inside seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet stillness that filled the air. Keanu Reeves stepped inside, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The gym, which had been filled with the sharp sounds of sparring and heavy bags hitting the floor, now felt different. There was no grand entrance, no flashy moves, just Keanu, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, with the kind of quiet confidence that only someone who truly understood themselves could exude. It wasn't about the clothes he wore or the fact that he was a famous actor. Keanu's presence was felt in the way he moved, how his calm gaze took in everything without judgment, how his mere presence shifted the energy in the room. The students, who had been bustling about, stopped for a moment, some not even realizing they had paused until they caught sight of him. Their eyes followed him as he crossed the floor with an ease that felt completely natural. There was no need for words. Keanu commanded respect without speaking, without trying. Even Riker, who had been in charge of this gym for years, felt the shift. He was a man who lived by power, by control, and now for the first time he felt uncertain. Riker's eyes narrowed as Keanu approached, his jaw tight with defensive energy. The power that had once felt so absolute in this gym suddenly seemed less certain, less rooted. Riker knew who Keanu was. Everyone did. But this wasn't a movie set. This was real life. And in real life, Riker believed his methods had earned him his place here. Keanu's eyes briefly met his, and there was no animosity in the look. It was as if Keanu had already seen everything he needed to see, understood the room in a way that only someone truly present could. Riker stepped forward, trying to mask the insecurity creeping up on him. He cleared his throat, straightening up. "Can I help you?" Riker's voice was forced, the dismissive tone clear. Keanu stopped, a few steps away from him, but didn't respond immediately. His presence in the gym was already saying more than words could. The silence stretched between them for a brief moment, but to Keanu it was not uncomfortable. It was simply a pause, like the calm before a storm. The weight of Riker's challenge hung in the air. Riker glanced at the students, who now seemed to be holding their breath. He didn't like feeling small, and right now, in front of Keanu, he felt like his usual dominance was slipping. He squared his shoulders, trying to take control of the situation. "You here to give me some pointers?" Riker asked, the edge of his voice betraying his underlying discomfort. "This gym runs fine on its own. My methods work, and I don't need anyone, especially a celebrity, coming in here telling me how to do my job." He tried to sound confident, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded more like a defense than a challenge. Keanu looked at him without rushing to respond, his expression calm, even slightly amused by the tension in Riker's voice. There was no arrogance, no judgment, only a quiet understanding, as if Keanu had already decided how this interaction would unfold. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried authority. "I'm not here to tell you how to run your gym," Keanu said simply. "But I do think it's important to remember that respect can't be forced." He paused, letting the words settle in the air between them. "It must be earned." Riker's jaw clenched tighter, his posture defensive as he stared at Keanu. The calm presence of the actor, so different from the aggressive environment Riker had created, left him unsettled. He wasn't used to this type of challenge, especially not from someone who had the fame and reputation that Keanu did. But Riker wasn't about to back down. "You're welcome to observe," Riker said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "But don't come in here thinking you know how to train my fighters." He gestured broadly to the gym, his tone dismissive. "I've built this gym on results. It's not about some pretty philosophy or what you see on TV." Keanu remained still, his expression neutral, his movements calm and controlled. "I'm not here to tell you how to run things. I'm here because I believe there's more to martial arts than just aggression. There's discipline, respect, and balance, he said, his voice steady. Those things can't be forced. They need to be understood and earned. The words landed, but Riker didn't want to hear them. His pride was flaring now, the discomfort growing as Keanu stood in front of him without the slightest hint of arrogance. Riker had spent years building his gym, pushing students to their limits through intimidation and force. He wasn't about to let some actor come in and question everything he believed in. You think you've got all the answers? Riker spat, his tone rising in frustration. This isn't a movie set, Keanu. This is real life. You think you can just waltz in here with your calm, zen attitude and tell me how to do my job? Keanu didn't flinch. He held Riker's gaze steadily, his eyes calm, as though he'd heard these words 100 times before. It's not about the movie or the set. It's about real strength, Keanu said quietly. Strength that doesn't need to show off, doesn't need to prove anything. It's about building people up, not breaking them down. Riker's fists clenched at his sides, frustration bubbling to the surface. He wasn't going to let this man undermine him. His gym was built on sweat and hard work, and Riker was determined to protect it. He took a step forward, his voice cold. You think you can just come in here and teach us something? He asked, trying to assert his authority. If you've got something to prove, do it somewhere else. This is my domain. Keanu took a small step forward, not backing down. His voice remained even and measured. I'm not here to prove anything to you, coach, he said simply. I'm here to show you that there's another way. The tension between the two men was palpable now. The students watched in silence, sensing the impending clash. Riker's pride was on the line, and Keanu's calm confidence seemed to be chipping away at it, piece by piece. The gym, once full of Riker's commanding presence, now felt different, as though the balance of power had shifted. Riker straightened, trying to regain control, but there was no hiding the vulnerability creeping up on him. Fine, he muttered, stay, but don't think for 1 second you can change what we do here. Keanu nodded slowly. I'm not here to change anything. I'm here to show you there's another way. You don't have to dominate to be strong. The gym was still. The clash of philosophies, of approaches, was palpable. Keanu stood, grounded, unwavering, as Riker tried to regain his footing. The challenge had been made. The atmosphere had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The stage was set for something deeper, something that would test not only Riker's authority, but his beliefs. Riker stood his ground, frustration bubbling under the surface. I don't need a philosophy lesson, he said, voice tense. My gym runs on results, not nice words. Keanu didn't flinch. Results matter, but fear doesn't build greatness. It makes people obey, but it doesn't make them better. His tone was calm, unwavering. True strength comes from teaching, not dominating. Riker's jaw clenched, but he couldn't deny the shift in the gym. Keanu's quiet authority was affecting everyone. You think you know better, Riker snapped, trying to maintain control. You're not running my class. Keanu stepped closer, his presence steady and unthreatening. I'm not here to run your class. But there's another way to teach. One that doesn't rely on fear. The tension thickened in the room. Riker's eyes flickered between Keanu and the students, some of whom were now watching intently. This wasn't a typical challenge. Riker's discomfort grew, but he refused to back down. You can stay, but don't interfere. Keanu nodded, calm as ever. I won't. But I'll show you that there's a different way to build strength. Riker's frustration burned, but Keanu's unshakable presence left him uncertain. As Keanu stood his ground, the gym held its breath. The stage was set for a shift, but how it would unfold was still to be seen. Keanu stood in the doorway, observing the room with a quiet presence that seemed to fill the gym without any effort. His gaze swept over the students, many of whom had been watching the tense exchange between him and Riker moments ago. He gave a small nod to the assistant coach, Ashley Chen, who had been standing on the sidelines, her arms crossed as she observed the growing tension between Riker and Keanu. With a calm, composed step, Keanu walked toward her, offering his hand for a handshake. Ashley took it, her eyes locking with his for a brief moment. "It's good to have you here, Keanu," she said with a smile, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. The way Riker had been acting, it was hard to know how things would unfold, but Keanu's quiet confidence seemed like a welcome shift from the atmosphere Riker had cultivated in the gym. Keanu smiled gently, his presence reassuring. "I'm just here to observe and, if I can, to share something that might help," he said. "We can all learn from each other." Ethan, who had been standing off to the side, still holding his cheek from the slap earlier, watched quietly. His father's calm energy seemed to settle the storm in the gym, even if his own emotions were still raw. His red cheek throbbed. But it wasn't the pain from the slap that lingered. He was more focused on the lesson his father was about to teach. Ethan had learned from Keanu to never meet aggression with aggression, but it was still hard to see it unfold like this. As Keanu spoke with Ashley, Riker had been pacing nearby, fuming at the interruption to his authority. The earlier irritation he'd felt at Keanu's presence was now boiling over, and he could no longer contain it. He walked toward Keanu and Ashley, his footsteps heavy on the gym's worn mats. Riker's eyes narrowed with frustration, and his voice was laced with annoyance when he addressed Keanu. "So, you think you can just walk in here and teach us something, huh?" Riker's tone was challenging, his arms crossed defensively. "You haven't even shown us anything, and you've already made everyone uncomfortable. If you're here, you better prove you've got something worth teaching." Keanu didn't respond with bravado or anger. He simply met Riker's eyes and gave a small nod, as though he had expected this challenge. "All right," Keanu said calmly, his voice never rising above a steady, composed tone. "I'll demonstrate. But I'm not here to show off or play to an audience. I'm here to show you that martial arts isn't about forcing technique or brute strength." Riker sneered, unable to hide his irritation. "Fine, if you want to show us so badly, get on the mat. Let's see what you've got." Keanu, without a hint of hesitation, moved to the center of the mat. There was no dramatic gesture, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet, purposeful step. He stood still for a moment, feeling the energy in the room shift as everyone's attention focused on him. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment to unfold. "I'll show you," Keanu began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity, "that martial arts isn't about dominating your opponent. It's about understanding balance, flow, and respect for the other person. It's about mastering control over your own actions." Keanu remained still, his posture calm and unshaken, as Riker stood across from him, seething with frustration. The gym had grown tense, every fighter in the room watching the two men, sensing the conflict between them. Riker's patience had long worn thin. He had spent his life pushing people through their limits, demanding submission through fear and aggression. But Keanu was a different presence entirely. There was no bluster, no flexing, only quiet confidence. "You want to teach something, huh?" Riker sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This gym doesn't need philosophy, it needs results." Keanu met his gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. "Results are important," he said, his voice soft but carrying authority. "But results without respect, without control, only lead to destruction. You're not teaching fighting, coach. You're teaching fear." Riker's nostrils flared at the challenge, but he wasn't about to back down. "You're welcome to stay, but don't think you can just waltz in here and change things," he growled. "If you're so sure you've got all the answers, let's see it." Keanu nodded slowly. "All right, coach," he said, stepping into the center of the mat. "Let's see if you're open to learning something new." Without waiting for further permission, Riker attacked. His moves were quick, aggressive, and direct, a barrage of jabs, hooks, and kicks. He moved with speed and power, determined to overwhelm Keanu, showing off the dominance he believed was necessary to win. But Keanu didn't flinch. His body shifted with barely a movement, each attack passing by him effortlessly. He didn't resist, didn't force his way through Riker's power. He simply moved with it. As Riker threw a right hook, Keanu dodged it by inches, barely stepping out of the way. He didn't need to overpower the punch, he simply redirected Riker's energy. The force of Riker's strike was wasted as Keanu flowed around it. It was graceful, precise, like water flowing around rocks, leaving no resistance. The gym watched in stunned silence. Riker paused, his breath coming in heavy bursts. His frustration grew. "You're dodging, you're not fighting," he barked. Keanu shook his head. "It's not about fighting," he said calmly. "It's about knowing when to yield and when to redirect. Power is only effective when you know how to use it. If you keep pushing against something stronger, you'll break. But if you learn to use your opponent's energy, you can control the fight without ever needing to dominate." Riker's face flushed. This was not what he expected. His mind raced as Keanu's words hit harder than the punches he'd thrown. He took a step back, breathing deeply, trying to process the challenge Keanu had just laid down. Riker's fists clenched, frustration boiling beneath the surface. The gym had gone silent, every student watching as Keanu stood unshaken, his calm presence unnerving Riker. "What's your point, Keanu?" Riker snapped, trying to regain control. "You think you can just come in here and teach us something?" Keanu remained unfazed, his voice steady. "I'm not here to take your job. I'm here to show you another way. Martial arts isn't about fighting for dominance. It's about balance, understanding, and respect for both yourself and your opponent." Riker's anger flared. Respect is earned by pushing people to their limits, not by talking about philosophy. He shot back, stepping closer to Keanu. "You can't just avoid a fight and expect respect." Keanu didn't budge. Strength isn't just physical. It's about knowing when to redirect, not resist. It's about controlling yourself, not forcing control over others. Riker's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting. "This is a gym, not a lecture hall. You think your calm method is going to work here?" Keanu met his eyes, unwavering. Respect isn't about forcing people to submit. It's about guiding them to become better without fear. The room was still, the tension thick in the air. Riker's face flushed with both anger and something else. Doubt. Keanu's words had started to chip away at his certainty, and for the first time, Riker wasn't sure if his way was the right one. Keanu stood in the center of the mat, still and composed. The gym was filled with a thick silence as every student watched him, the air charged with anticipation. Keanu didn't need to make a grand gesture to command attention. His quiet presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. There were no theatrics, just calm focus and confidence. He turned to the class and spoke in his usual steady tone. "I need a volunteer," he said. "Someone confident enough to demonstrate with me." For a moment, no one moved. The students looked at each other, unsure of whether they should step forward. Keanu's calmness seemed to create an invisible barrier, one they weren't sure how to approach. Then, Malik, the most experienced fighter in the gym, stepped forward. Tall, muscular, and confident, Malik was the kind of fighter who relied on strength and power. His reputation in the gym was built on sheer force. Malik wasn't intimidated by Keanu's calm demeanor. He thought he could easily overpower the actor-turned-teacher. After all, what could Keanu possibly show him about fighting? Still, he was curious about the challenge. Keanu gave a nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Molly," he said softly, and turned back to the class. "What I'm going to show you today isn't about brute strength. It's about timing, balance, and using your opponent's energy to your advantage." Malik stood ready, his stance firm. "Let's see what you've got," he said, his confidence unwavering. Keanu didn't waste a moment. He motioned for Malik to attack. Malik, as expected, threw a punch, a quick jab aimed at Keanu's chest. But instead of blocking or countering with his own strength, Keanu sidestepped the punch with minimal movement. He didn't meet Malik's force with his own. Instead, he guided Malik's momentum to the side. The punch missed completely, and Malik, moving too fast, found himself off balance. The class watched in stunned silence. Malik, who had expected Keanu to block or fight back, was left standing there, bewildered. He took a step back to regain his footing, his confidence shaken for the first time in a long while. Keanu turned to the students, his tone steady. "It's not about overpowering your opponent. It's about using timing and precision to control the situation." Malik shook off the confusion and squared up again, this time more cautiously. He was used to overpowering his opponents with strength, but Keanu's technique was unlike anything he had experienced. This wasn't about brute force. It was about understanding the flow of energy, something that Malik wasn't used to considering in a fight. Keanu stood relaxed, waiting for Malik to make his next move. He didn't speak, didn't make a dramatic gesture. He simply stood there, his presence enough to draw the class's attention. Malik threw another punch, faster this time, aiming for Keanu's side. But again, Keanu didn't try to block it. Instead, he stepped to the side, guiding Malik's arm as if he were leading it away from his body. Malik's punch lost all its power as he was redirected, his body forced to continue forward, almost stumbling. This time, there was no confusion in Malik's eyes. There was realization. Keanu wasn't fighting back with force. He was using his opponent's energy against him, redirecting it with minimal movement. Keanu's calmness was disorienting, and Malik found himself out of his element. He took a step back, trying to recenter himself. Keanu's voice cut through the silence, still calm and steady. "It's not about meeting force with force," he said. "It's about understanding when to yield and when to redirect. If you fight with power, you'll always be exhausted. But if you learn to flow, to control the situation, you don't have to use much energy at all." Malik, now more focused, adjusted his stance and moved in again. This time, he threw a series of punches, a jab, a hook, and a cross, hoping to overwhelm Keanu. But Keanu didn't flinch. With each punch, he moved ever so slightly, redirecting the energy, never once using force to block the attack. It was all about timing. Malik's punches missed their target, his movements growing more erratic as he realized the futility of trying to overpower Keanu. The class was still silent, and the tension in the air was palpable. Every student in the gym had just witnessed something extraordinary. Keanu had made it look so effortless, and yet it was clear to everyone that there was more going on than just a demonstration of technique. Keanu wasn't just showing them how to fight. He was teaching them something far more valuable: control over oneself. Malik stopped, his breath coming in heavier gasps as he backed away, his eyes fixed on Keanu. He had thrown everything he had at the man: his speed, his power, and his technique. But none of it had worked. Keanu had effortlessly redirected his attacks, using minimal movement to deflect them, making Malik feel almost foolish. It was a humbling experience, one that he wasn't used to. Keanu turned to the rest of the class, his voice calm and clear. "You see, it's not about size or strength. A larger opponent can be neutralized not through overpowering force, but by understanding their movements and using their energy to your advantage." He looked around the room, making eye contact with several students. This is what martial arts is really about: balance, flow, and respect, not just brute force. The students watched, still processing what they had just witnessed. Some were skeptical, unsure whether Keanu's methods could really work in a real fight. But others, especially those who had struggled with Riker's aggressive approach, felt a spark of something new, something more profound. There was a quiet power in Keanu's simplicity, something that didn't rely on dominating your opponent, but on understanding and control. Keanu's focus shifted back to Malik, who was standing a few feet away, trying to steady himself. "Malik, would you like to try again?" Keanu asked, his tone inviting but not demanding. Malik, still visibly shaken by the demonstration, nodded. He was proud, yes, but also a little humbled. He had always relied on his strength, and here was a man who had shown him that it wasn't the size of the fighter, but the control of the fight that mattered. Malik stepped forward once more, his confidence slowly returning, but this time he was more aware. He had felt Keanu's technique, and now he wanted to learn from it. Keanu nodded, sensing the shift. "This time, Malik, I want you to try something different. Attack, but with control. Think about your movements. No rushing, no power, just precision." Malik paused, taking a deep breath. For the first time that day, he didn't feel the need to overpower Keanu. He understood what Keanu was teaching. The class, too, felt the shift in the air as Malik slowly approached Keanu again, ready to engage, not with force, but with focus. The tension in the gym was thick as Coach Riker watched Keanu's calm display of technique. Every fiber of Riker's being rebelled against the thought that someone, especially a movie star, could come into his gym and show him how to teach martial arts. He had built this gym with blood, sweat, and aggression, and the thought that Keanu could take a few sidesteps and redirect energy without breaking a sweat was infuriating. Riker's fists clenched at his sides as he watched Keanu interact with Malik. The ease with which Keanu had controlled the fight, not through strength but through timing and redirection, was like a slap to Riker's pride. He had been teaching these students for years, using the methods he believed were the only way to truly fight, to dominate, to win. Keanu, noticing the shift in Riker's demeanor, continued to speak to the students, emphasizing the importance of control over brute force. "Martial arts," he said, "isn't about power. It's about understanding. When you control yourself, you control the fight." But Riker wasn't listening to the words anymore. His ego, bruised and irritated, boiled over. The silence in the gym was suffocating as he took a few steps forward, his eyes locked on Keanu. "This is ridiculous," Riker spat, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Redirecting energy? You've got to be kidding me. That won't work in a real fight. Power is what wins. A real fighter doesn't dance around, they strike, they overwhelm. And you're telling me this technique will work in the real world?" Keanu didn't flinch, didn't step back. He stood firm, his posture calm, his eyes steady. "It's not about dancing around, coach. It's about balance. Power is only useful when it's controlled." Riker's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Controlled? You've got to prove that to me, Keanu. How about a sparring match, right here, right now? Let's see how well you handle real power." Keanu didn't flinch at Riker's challenge. His calm demeanor never wavered, but something in his eyes, something quieter than words, showed that he was fully aware of the tension now crackling between them. The gym fell into a heavy silence as everyone awaited his response. Malik, still recovering from the earlier demonstration, stood off to the side, watching with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You think you can just walk in here, spout your philosophy, and leave without proving anything?" Riker continued, his frustration evident. "You're teaching nothing. You're just showing us how to dodge, how to look good. I want to see if you can really fight, not just talk about balance." Keanu took a moment before speaking, his voice calm, as if he had already anticipated this moment. "This lesson isn't about fighting, coach. It's about teaching students to understand their own bodies, their own movements. It's not about power, it's about precision and timing." Riker's anger flared. His pride couldn't take it any longer. He had spent years building his reputation as a tough, no-nonsense coach. The idea that someone like Keanu could walk in and undermine everything he believed in was simply too much. "You're saying this isn't about fighting?" Riker shot back, his voice growing louder. "You don't think real fighters need to prove themselves?" "I don't need someone coming in here with soft words, showing off like they're above all of us." Keanu's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. He stepped forward, meeting Riker's challenge without raising his voice. "I'm not above anyone," he said softly. "I'm here to show another way. You don't need to prove yourself by beating others down. A true fighter doesn't have to dominate. They just have to know when to act, when to redirect." Riker's chest heaved, anger and insecurity swirling inside him. "You want to prove something, Keanu? Then let's do this. No more talk. Let's spar. And I'll show you what real power looks like." The gym's atmosphere shifted the moment Riker issued the challenge. The students, who had been quietly observing the exchange, now stood at attention, unsure of what to expect. It was clear that Riker was testing Keanu, not just his technique, but his ability to handle the pressure, the challenge to his authority. Keanu, however, remained composed, his expression unchanged. Keanu nodded slightly, acknowledging the challenge. "If that's what you need, coach," he said, his voice still calm, "I'll spar with you. But remember, it's not about power." Riker smirked, his confidence surging. He was used to overpowering anyone who dared question him, and he was sure this actor-turned-teacher wouldn't be an exception. "We'll see about that," Riker muttered under his breath, stepping onto the mat. Keanu didn't follow immediately. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. It wasn't about proving himself to Riker or anyone else in the gym. It was about showing the class that strength didn't come from brute force. It came from within. Keanu had nothing to prove. He had already won the internal battle of discipline and self-control. Malik, still watching from the sidelines, felt a pang of nervousness in his chest. Keanu's calm was almost otherworldly, but even he couldn't deny the skill and power that Riker possessed. The gym's energy had shifted. The students were on edge, uncertain of what would happen next. Riker, noticing Keanu's hesitation, raised an eyebrow. "You waiting for an invitation?" he sneered, his posture ready for action. He was itching to show everyone that his way was the only way, and he was going to enjoy every second of putting Keanu in his place. Keanu finally moved toward the mat, his expression still soft but focused. "Let's begin," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of his presence. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men squared off. Keanu didn't take a fighting stance. Instead, he stood quietly, his body relaxed, waiting for Riker to make the first move. The tension in the gym was palpable. Students crowded the edges of the mat, their eyes fixed on Keanu and Riker, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. It had been building all day, the tension between Keanu's calm and Riker's fiery ego, and now it was about to reach its boiling point. The air was thick with anticipation as the two men squared off, their postures dramatically different. Keanu moved onto the mat with a sense of quiet authority. His movements were deliberate, measured, each step purposeful yet effortless. The students watched with wide eyes, some nervous, others excited to see how the calm, composed man would face the challenge. Keanu's presence had shifted the atmosphere of the gym entirely, and now, as he stood there in a relaxed stance, the energy was different. It was as if the space had expanded, the weight of the situation pressing in on everyone, yet Keanu stood unaffected by it all. Riker, on the other hand, was already seething with frustration, his muscles tensed, his jaw clenched. His entire persona was built around strength and dominance. This calm, soft-spoken teacher had dared to challenge his authority in front of his students. Riker couldn't let it go. He needed to prove that his way, the way of aggression and force, was the only true path. Without a word, Riker launched himself at Keanu, his movements fast and fierce. He wasn't holding back. His strikes came in a rapid succession: left jab, right cross, followed by a sharp kick aimed at Keanu's midsection. His eyes were filled with rage, his body focused on one thing: overpowering the calm, collected man in front of him. Keanu didn't move for the first few seconds. He simply watched Riker's approach, his gaze never leaving his opponent. The students held their breath, expecting an immediate response, but Keanu remained still. It was a test of patience, a demonstration that Keanu wasn't reacting out of fear or instinct. He was waiting. And as Riker's first punch closed in on him, Keanu finally shifted, sidestepping the attack with a fluid, almost imperceptible motion. The class gasped, a collective sound of disbelief. Riker's punch missed by a hair, his body moving past Keanu, out of control. Keanu didn't waste a single movement. As Riker's momentum carried him forward, Keanu simply turned his body slightly, guiding him off balance without using any force of his own. Riker stumbled slightly but quickly regained his footing. His eyes flashed with a mixture of surprise and frustration. He had charged at Keanu with full force, expecting his size and speed to overwhelm him. Instead, Keanu had effortlessly sidestepped the punch, guiding his own energy to throw him off balance without ever using force. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Riker's next move was a flurry of attacks, a combination of jabs, hooks, and a low kick aimed at Keanu's legs. He was determined to force Keanu into a corner, to prove that his power would eventually win out. The gym watched in silence as Riker's strikes grew faster and more aggressive. But Keanu, with his calm, unwavering focus, continued to move with fluidity and precision. He didn't block or parry, he didn't punch back. Instead, with every strike, Keanu gently sidestepped or redirected Riker's attacks. He used the same principle he had demonstrated earlier with Malik, redirecting Riker's force, not meeting it head-on, but guiding it away with subtle movements. Riker's strikes were growing more frantic as he realized his attacks were failing. With each punch he threw, Keanu seemed to be one step ahead, effortlessly moving with the rhythm of the fight. Riker's body was becoming more tense, his mind racing, trying to find an opening, trying to land a blow that would prove his point. Keanu, on the other hand, remained steady. He didn't rush. He didn't try to show off. There was no need to prove anything. His movements were calm, fluid, and measured, each one designed to redirect the aggression of his opponent, not stop it with force. He simply observed, reacted, and guided the energy away from him, showing the class what true control looked like. The gym was completely silent now. The students were watching, mesmerized by the contrast between Riker's brute force and Keanu's controlled, effortless movements. Riker's frustration grew as he missed strike after strike, his movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. Keanu's calmness seemed to unsettle him more with every moment. Riker's breath grew heavier as his attacks became wilder, his strikes now more aggressive but increasingly futile. The gym, once filled with the sounds of punches landing against pads and the rhythm of sparring, had gone silent except for the sound of Riker's heavy breathing. His muscles were straining, his movements becoming sloppy as the realization dawned on him that Keanu wasn't just dodging his attacks, he was controlling them, guiding his energy to the side without ever raising a fist. Keanu's movements were a study in efficiency. Each time Riker came at him with full force, Keanu redirected the energy with a slight shift in his body, never needing to block or counterattack. There was no struggle, no effort. It was as though Riker's force was simply being absorbed into Keanu's calmness. The contrast between their fighting styles was so stark that even the students who had trained under Riker for years were beginning to question everything they had learned. Riker's frustration was palpable. He had spent years perfecting his techniques, his aggression, his physical power. He had prided himself on pushing his students to their limits, using force and intimidation as his tools for earning respect. But here was Keanu, someone who didn't rely on force, who didn't try to dominate with raw power. Instead, he had shown them that the greatest power lay in control, not over others, but over oneself. Riker, now sweating and panting, finally stopped. He stood there, breathing heavily, glaring at Keanu, who had yet to break a sweat. The gym was eerily quiet as Riker caught his breath. His ego, bruised and battered, was now visibly cracked. He couldn't understand how someone like Keanu, with no flashy techniques or overwhelming power, had beaten him without even striking a single blow. Keanu took a small step back, his expression still calm. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't trying to prove anything. His voice, steady as ever, broke the silence. Fighting isn't about beating someone. It's about understanding them, and understanding yourself. The students exchanged glances, their eyes wide with realization. This wasn't just a lesson in fighting, it was a lesson in life. Riker didn't respond. His body was still tense, his mind racing. But deep down he knew Keanu was right. He had been so focused on strength, on winning, on dominating, that he had forgotten what real mastery looked like. It wasn't about overpowering your opponent. It was about mastering yourself. Riker's frustration was palpable. Every strike he threw, every punch aimed at Keanu, was either avoided or redirected with minimal effort. The tension in his shoulders grew as he continued to press forward, his moves becoming sloppier and more desperate with every failed attempt. He was used to being in control, used to dominating in the gym, but now it felt like every punch he threw was countered before it even landed. The realization hit him harder with every miss. The calmness Keanu demonstrated, the simplicity of his movements, was beating him at his own game. Riker's muscles burned with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His movements were no longer precise or controlled. His fists flailed through the air, wild and aggressive, driven by frustration. He had forgotten his own training in his need to prove himself. Each punch was an attempt to break through the calm that Keanu had maintained effortlessly. But the more he pushed, the more he overextended himself, leaving openings for Keanu to slip away. Keanu, still moving with the same fluidity, effortlessly dodged each of Riker's wild punches. He didn't need to block or parry, he simply let Riker's energy carry him in the direction it was already going, redirecting it without ever using his own strength. Keanu's body moved with the precision of someone who understood their opponent's every move, every intent, before it even happened. Riker, his face flushed and his movements growing more erratic, continued to charge. Each time Keanu sidestepped or evaded a strike, Riker's frustration grew. His confidence had been shattered by the ease with which Keanu had handled him. The calm, unassuming man in front of him was showing him a lesson in humility, a lesson he was not willing to accept. Keanu, however, didn't fight back with aggression or force. He continued to demonstrate the difference between forceful aggression and controlled movement. The gym fell into a deep silence, the only sound the rush of Riker's breath and the occasional swish of air as his punches missed their target. Riker's desperation mounted. He was a seasoned fighter, someone who prided himself on his ability to overpower opponents with sheer force. Yet here he was, struggling to land a single punch on Keanu, who seemed to glide effortlessly out of the way. His once controlled movements were now frantic, wild. He pushed harder, faster, hoping that sheer aggression would break through Keanu's calm. The gym's atmosphere shifted from one of quiet anticipation to palpable tension. Students watched in silence, their eyes glued to the two men in the center of the mat. They had seen Riker fight countless times, and they knew the power he possessed. But today, they were witnessing something entirely different. A contrast between Riker's brute force and Keanu's calm precision. Keanu's movements were still fluid, unhurried. Every time Riker came at him, Keanu was a step ahead, guiding Riker's energy away from him with gentle redirection. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary force. he simply allowed Riker's aggression to carry itself past him. It wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. And Riker, despite his best efforts, couldn't seem to grasp the lesson. Riker's movements were becoming more erratic. He overextended his jab, his balance slipping with every failed strike. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he realized he had no control over the situation. His pride was on the line now. This wasn't just a sparring match anymore. It was about proving he was right, that his way of fighting, his philosophy, was superior. But with each miss, he was proving the opposite. Keanu's calmness, his stillness, was starting to have an effect on the gym. The students, who had once been enthralled by Riker's dominance, were now watching him with new eyes. They could see the difference between raw power and true control. And Keanu was showing them that control didn't come from aggression. It came from understanding, from knowing when to act and when to let go. Keanu moved again, effortlessly evading another wild punch from Riker. It was almost as if Riker's attacks had no purpose, like the energy was being drained from them the moment they left his body. And Keanu wasn't even trying to prove anything. He was simply demonstrating the truth of his method. Ah! Riker's face flushed with anger and exhaustion. His fists, once sharp and controlled, were now swinging aimlessly. His legs, which had once moved with purpose, were growing slower. His body was betraying him. His pride refused to let him accept that Keanu's calm, almost passive approach was working. And it drove him to fight harder, to push further into desperation. Keanu, however, was still unmoved. He didn't rush in to counterattack. He didn't show frustration. He remained a picture of control, his body relaxed yet ever present, anticipating each move Riker made before it even happened. He simply guided Riker's energy, letting his opponent's momentum carry him forward, away from the target. It was clear now, Riker wasn't just losing the fight. He was losing his confidence, his ego, unraveling with every missed punch. Its ego unraveling with every missed punch. In one final, frantic attempt, Riker lunged forward, his body tensing as he threw a wild hook aimed directly at Keanu's head. It was a move driven purely by emotion, a last-ditch effort to overpower his opponent. But Keanu, with a barely perceptible movement, stepped aside, just enough to let Riker's punch sail harmlessly through the air. Then, with minimal effort, Keanu executed a simple, fluid sweep of his leg, sending Riker to the ground with barely any contact. Riker hit the mat hard, his breath knocked out of him, his body sprawled on the floor. The gym fell completely silent. Keanu stood above him, his expression unchanged. There was no gloating, no look of triumph in his eyes. He had done what he had set out to do, not defeat Riker, but show him the difference between aggression and control. Keanu had used no force, no strength, just the momentum Riker had given him, guiding it with precision and timing. Riker lay on the mat, dazed and humiliated. His ego had taken a hard blow and he was too proud to admit it. The students around the gym remained silent, processing what they had just witnessed. Keanu hadn't just demonstrated a technique, he had shown them what true mastery looked like. Keanu extended a hand to Riker, offering him help to get back on his feet. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of understanding in it. "It's not about domination, coach. It's about understanding when to act, when to yield, and when to let go." Riker, still on the floor, took a moment before reaching up and accepting Keanu's hand. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The lesson had been taught. Riker remained seated on the mat, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His body ached, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. He had just been shown something he had spent years ignoring, something that contradicted everything he had believed about strength and power. Keanu, standing above him, offered a hand. It wasn't an offer of victory. It was simply a gesture of respect, of understanding. Riker's eyes met Keanu's. He was exhausted, physically drained from the match. His pride had taken a beating, but something deeper had been touched, something he couldn't quite put into words. The old Riker would have refused the hand, would have fought harder to prove himself right. But today, something had shifted. He was too tired to fight back. He was too tired to be angry. For the first time in a long time, Riker felt the weight of his own ego. The same ego that had fueled his harshness, his need for dominance. And he began to realize it wasn't the strength he had thought it was. It was the thing that had been holding him back. With a slow, reluctant motion, Riker reached up and took Keanu's hand. The gesture was small, but for Riker, it felt monumental. He allowed Keanu to help him to his feet, the tension in his body easing, but not completely. There was still a war going on inside him, a war between the man who had built this gym on intimidation and the man who was beginning to understand that real strength came from something more subtle. The students around the gym had been watching the entire exchange in silence. They had seen their coach, the man who had led them with his forceful methods, brought to his knees, not by physical dominance, but by the quiet power of control and balance. Ethan stood at the edge of the mat, his cheek still stinging from earlier. His eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and understanding, were fixed on the two men. Keanu's voice broke through the silence. True strength isn't about how hard you can hit or how much you can dominate. It's about knowing when not to fight. It's about balance, discipline, and understanding the difference between force and control. Riker, still winded, nodded slowly. The weight of Keanu's words sank in. He didn't respond right away. There was too much to process. But he could feel the truth in them. His whole life had been about proving his power, pushing others to their limits, demanding respect through fear. But here was Keanu, showing him a new way, a way that didn't require domination, a way that didn't rely on making others submit. Keanu's words lingered in the air, settling in the gym like a weight. The students, who had been so used to Riker's harsh methods, began to exchange glances, as if something had just clicked for them. The tension that had filled the room during the sparring match began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. Even Ethan, still nursing the sting of the slap, found something comforting in what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just a lesson for Riker. It was a lesson for everyone watching. Riker, now standing, took a deep breath. His chest was still tight, but not from exertion. It was something deeper. It was the realization that all his years of pushing and demanding respect through aggression had been a facade. He had built a gym that focused on power and dominance, but it had come at the expense of something more important. True mastery. The truth had been so simple, yet so elusive to him. Strength, real strength, wasn't about overpowering others. It was about controlling oneself, understanding the flow of the situation, and knowing when to hold back. Do you understand now? Keanu's voice was soft, but it carried a weight that Riker couldn't ignore. The question wasn't just rhetorical. It was an invitation. Riker could feel the shift in his mindset, the crack in his armor. He had spent so long building himself up with the idea that he had to be the strongest, the toughest, the most feared. But now, Keanu was showing him a different path, one that didn't require cruelty or aggression. Riker didn't immediately answer. Instead, he lowered his gaze, his eyes scanning the worn mat beneath him. He had been so blinded by his own ego that he hadn't even realized how much he had been missing. The lesson Keanu had taught him was simple, yet profound. It wasn't about proving he was the strongest. It was about showing the students, and himself, what true strength looked like. Not through physical force, but through control, balance, and respect. The gym was quiet now, but there was an energy in the air, a shift in the dynamics of the space. For the first time, Riker was aware of how much he had let fear govern his teachings. The loud, aggressive commands had always been a way to keep control, to keep his students in line. But it hadn't taught them what real martial arts was about. Keanu had shown him that. The gym was silent, but the tension had shifted. Riker stood in the center of the mat, still catching his breath, his mind racing. The reality of the lesson hit him hard. His whole approach to martial arts had been about dominance, about pushing his students to their limits through fear and aggression. But what Keanu had shown him was different. He had shown him that strength came from balance, from controlling oneself, not overpowering others. The students, who had been conditioned to fear Riker's authority, now watched with different eyes. They saw their coach, the man who had driven them with raw force, humbled not by Keanu's strength, but by his quiet control. Riker felt their gaze, but this time it wasn't judgment, it was understanding. He realized that he had been too focused on proving his own power, and in doing so had missed the true essence of martial arts. Keanu stood patiently, offering no words of triumph, just quiet support. His hand was still extended, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Riker could feel the weight of his pride crumbling, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid to let go of it. He reached up and accepted Keanu's hand. It wasn't just an act of physical support. It was a symbol of his willingness to change, to learn. "Thank you," Riker muttered, the words foreign but necessary. He had spent so much time focused on teaching with fear, thinking that respect could only be earned through force. But Keanu had shown him the true meaning of martial arts, not as a means of domination, but as a way to foster respect, discipline, and control. Keanu gave a small nod, his calm demeanor unchanged. "It's not about winning," he said softly. "It's about teaching and learning." Riker stood in silence, absorbing the weight of Keanu's words. He wasn't sure how to move forward, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to start over. His approach had been flawed, but it wasn't too late to change. Keanu stood in the center of the gym, the room now quiet as all eyes were on him. His calm presence was a stark contrast to the intensity that had once filled this space. The students were still processing what they had witnessed: Riker's humbling defeat, the lessons Keanu had shared, and the undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The gym, once filled with tension and fear, now seemed like a space for growth and understanding. Keanu took a deep breath and began speaking, his voice steady, clear, and filled with purpose. "Martial arts isn't about fear," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's not about domination or humiliating your opponent. It's not about proving you're the strongest. It's about mutual respect, self-restraint, and understanding." As he spoke, the students listened intently. Ethan stood near the back of the room, still feeling the sting of the slap he had received earlier. But now, with Keanu's words, there was a shift inside him. He felt a sense of clarity, like the lessons his father had taught him were finally being fully realized. It wasn't about brute strength, it was about balance, about controlling one's emotions and understanding the flow of energy in a fight and in life. Keanu continued, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of each student. "In a real fight, your opponent is not the enemy. The true enemy is within you. It's the anger, the fear, the pride that clouds your judgment and makes you act without thought. A true warrior is someone who knows when not to fight, when to let go, when to remain still, and when to use their energy wisely." Riker, standing off to the side, was still processing the day's events. He had always believed that fear and aggression were the keys to earning respect, that pushing others to their limits was the only way to build strength. But now, hearing Keanu's words, he felt a flicker of doubt in his own methods. His body was still sore from the sparring match, but it was his mind that was truly aching. For the first time, he was listening. He wasn't just teaching anymore, he was learning. Keanu paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The gym was still, the air thick with reflection. Riker stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his posture less rigid than before. He wasn't looking at Keanu, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. The harshness that had once been part of his character now felt out of place, like an old coat that no longer fit. Keanu broke the silence, his voice gentle but firm. Every martial artist, every teacher must ask themselves, what are we teaching our students? Are we teaching them to dominate, to break their spirit? Or are we teaching them to grow, to find strength in discipline and respect, to fight without anger? That is the true art of a warrior. His words weren't just directed at Riker, they were for everyone in the room. The students had been raised on the idea that martial arts was about proving strength, pushing through pain, and coming out on top. But now, they were being asked to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Keanu's philosophy wasn't about fighting harder, it was about fighting smarter, with purpose and control. Ethan, who had been standing at the edge of the gym, felt a surge of understanding. The slap from earlier still stung, but it was nothing compared to the clarity Keanu's words had brought. He realized that martial arts wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about mental and emotional strength. His father had always emphasized discipline, but now he saw it wasn't just about controlling the body, it was about mastering the mind. Riker, still standing off to the side, felt the shift within himself. Keanu's words resonated deeply, piercing through the armor he had built around his own beliefs. For years, he had taught his students to fight with anger, to push through their limitations, to break the spirit of their opponents. But now, he was beginning to see that true mastery wasn't in force. It was in the ability to remain calm, to control the situation without losing oneself to emotion. The gym, once tense and filled with intimidation, now felt different. The students were looking at each other, some with new respect, others with quiet contemplation. The atmosphere had shifted from one of fear to one of understanding. Keanu's gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on each student. His presence was calm but commanding. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone here," he continued. "You don't need to overpower your opponent to earn respect. Respect is given freely, and you, as martial artists, must earn it, not by domination but by how you carry yourself, how you conduct yourself in and outside of this gym." Riker's stance had softened. His arms were still crossed, but his posture had lost its usual arrogance. He was no longer the unshakable coach who demanded respect through fear. The lesson was sinking in, slowly but surely. He had always believed that his way was the only way. But now, there was a nagging doubt. Keanu wasn't asking him to abandon his students or his gym. He was simply asking him to evolve, to change the way he taught, to become better. Martial arts, Keanu said, turning his focus back to the students, is about understanding yourself, your limits, your emotions, and your purpose. It's not about who can land the hardest punch, but who can keep their composure when everything around them is chaotic. His voice softened. When you can control yourself, then you can truly control the situation. Riker shifted, his mind working overtime to process Keanu's words. His pride, once so fiercely protected, was beginning to fracture. He had been a teacher, a coach, for years, and yet it felt like Keanu had unlocked something in him that he hadn't known was missing. Keanu looked over at Riker, meeting his gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, no condescension, only quiet understanding. You can't teach others to control themselves if you don't control yourself first. If you teach out of fear, they will only learn fear. But if you teach out of respect, they will learn strength. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Riker's heart was still racing, but now it was from a different kind of realization. He had been wrong. He had been teaching his students how to fight, but not how to live. Keanu's lesson wasn't just about martial arts. It was about life. Ethan watched his father as Keanu stood in the center of the gym, speaking to the students. The calmness in his voice, the way he moved with such purpose. It was nothing like the aggressive energy that had once filled the room under Riker's watch. Keanu wasn't demonstrating force or power, but something far more powerful: the control over one's self and the respect for others. The lesson was so simple, yet so profound. Ethan had always known his father was different, but today it wasn't just about the legacy Keanu carried as a former martial artist or movie star. It was about the values that Ethan had learned from him over the years. The values that made Keanu not just a martial artist, but a teacher, a mentor, and above all, a father. As Keanu spoke, Ethan's mind drifted back to their time together, to the lessons his father had imparted. There had been so many moments, whether it was in the backyard practicing moves or during quiet conversations about the nature of discipline and control. Ethan had always looked up to his father, but now, after seeing Keanu demonstrate his philosophy in front of the class, he understood the true depth of those teachings. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about how you carry yourself in life. Ethan realized he had been carrying around a weight, this desire to prove himself, to show everyone that he was more than just Keanu Reeves' son. He had felt the need to prove that he was strong, capable, worthy of respect. But now, watching his father in action, Ethan realized that real strength wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about standing out. It was about understanding who you are, controlling your emotions, and giving respect freely without expecting anything in return. Keanu's words echoed in Ethan's mind. True strength is about balance. It's about control, not aggression. Ethan understood now that the greatest power lay not in physical ability or external recognition, but in the quiet mastery of oneself. Ethan took a deep breath and moved toward his father. The gym had quieted, the students' attention still focused on Keanu. The lesson wasn't just for them. It had reached Ethan in a way that he hadn't expected. As he approached his father, there was a sense of calmness that had replaced the nervous energy he had carried earlier. Keanu noticed Ethan's approach and gave him a small smile. It wasn't the smile of a proud father, but rather a quiet acknowledgement, as though he understood the journey Ethan was on. Ethan stood next to him for a moment, watching the students who were now absorbing every word, every lesson that Keanu spoke. It was then that Ethan realized he had always been caught up in the pressure to be someone else's idea of strong, to match the expectations others had of him. The other students, the gym, the world, they all had their ideas about what it meant to be tough or capable, but today, Keanu had shown him that strength wasn't about meeting those external expectations. It wasn't about dominating anyone or proving anything. It was about knowing yourself and using your strength with purpose and integrity. Ethan found himself standing taller, his shoulders less tense. There was no more need to prove anything to the others or even to himself. He had learned that the quiet strength his father displayed was the strength he could rely on: self-control, respect, and humility. These weren't just things his father taught him in words, they were the values Keanu embodied in every action. With those thoughts in mind, Ethan turned to his father. He didn't need to say much. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that reflected everything he had learned that day. "Dad?" Ethan said quietly, his voice steady. "Thank you." Keanu met his son's gaze, the same quiet understanding in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Ethan. You've always known the real strength. You just needed to see it clearly." Ethan nodded. He hadn't fully understood before, but now, in this moment, it felt like a piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. The lesson wasn't about fighting, it was about living with purpose, with balance, and above all, with respect. For yourself and for others. The gym was still buzzing with the energy of Keanu's demonstration, but for Ethan it felt like everything had slowed down. He had always looked at his father through the lens of admiration, but now, for the first time, he understood the depth of what Keanu had taught him. It wasn't just about the physical moves or the lessons from martial arts. It was about living with integrity and using strength not for dominance, but for balance. Ethan took another step closer to Keanu, who was still watching the students with a calm gaze, a small but knowing smile on his face. Ethan could feel the weight of the shift in his own heart, how his perception of strength had completely changed. He had spent so long trying to prove his worth to the world, trying to show people that he could stand on his own. But now he realized that true strength didn't come from proving anything to anyone. It came from being at peace with yourself. "Dad, I get it now," Ethan said, his voice quieter than before, but filled with a new sense of clarity. "It's not about proving how strong you are. It's about knowing when not to fight and when to just be." He looked down, feeling the full weight of what he had just said. For years he had tried to fight his own inner battles, trying to be something he wasn't. But now, it felt like he had unlocked something inside himself. Keanu placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his eyes filled with pride, but more importantly, understanding. "You've always known, Ethan. It's just about trusting that strength is more than the physical. It's the mental and emotional discipline that keeps you centered, no matter what life throws at you." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of pride in his chest. The words weren't just empty advice. They were truths that had been passed down through his father's actions, his teachings, and his life. Ethan didn't need to prove anything. He had everything he needed inside him. As the students began to filter out of the gym, Keanu and Ethan stood together, side by side. Ethan felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He had learned something more valuable than any fighting technique. He had learned the true meaning of strength, and he knew that it wasn't just about martial arts. It was about life, respect, and balance. The gym was nearly empty now, the final claps and murmurs of the students fading as they gathered their belongings and filtered out. Ethan had already left with his friends, but Keanu remained, sitting quietly by the edge of the mat, his focus still on the students' growth rather than his own success. The gym, once tense and full of hostility, now felt different, calmer, almost reflective. It wasn't long before Riker approached. He had been watching from a distance, his mind processing everything that had unfolded over the past hours. His eyes were no longer filled with the brash arrogance that had once characterized him, but with something more vulnerable: guilt, regret, and a dawning realization that his methods had been flawed. He had pushed too hard, driven by an ego that had clouded his judgment. Now seeing Keanu's quiet strength, he felt the weight of it all. Keanu noticed Riker's approach, his expression calm as always. He didn't rise to meet him or offer any grand gesture of acknowledgement. Keanu knew this was Riker's moment. Riker had to come to the realization on his own. The gym was still, only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead breaking the silence. "Keanu," Riker's voice was softer than usual, lacking the usual confidence it carried when he was in control of the room. I need to apologize for what happened with Ethan today. I've been teaching all the wrong things. You were right. It wasn't about fighting. It's about respect, control, balance." Keanu regarded him quietly for a moment, absorbing the apology without comment. He didn't need to say anything right away. Riker was speaking from a place of genuine self-reflection. There was a depth in his voice that Keanu hadn't heard before. "I pushed him too hard," Riker continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was the only way to get results, to make them tough. But it's clear now that all I was doing was breaking them down, not building them up." Keanu didn't interrupt, letting the words flow. He had seen this moment coming, seen Riker's frustration turning inward. The coach wasn't as hard on his students as he was on himself. Keanu knew that Riker wasn't a bad person. He was just lost in the idea of what it meant to be a successful teacher. And now, he was searching for a way to be better. Keanu stood silently for a moment, then nodded slowly. His presence was steady, unshaken by Riker's confession. Apology accepted, Keanu said simply, his tone calm yet carrying weight. But apologies are just the beginning. The real work is what comes after. Riker shifted his weight, his shoulders tense as he absorbed Keanu's words. He had expected to feel lighter, but the truth of the situation only seemed to settle deeper into his chest. The apology wasn't enough. The damage he'd done wasn't just to Ethan, it was to the students, to the gym, to himself. His methods had created a culture of fear, and Keanu's gentle but firm approach had shown him a better way. Keanu spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. Change takes time, Riker. You can't undo years of habits overnight, but the first step is recognizing where you've gone wrong and making the conscious choice to do better. That starts with respecting your students, not through fear, but through understanding. Riker's gaze dropped to the floor, his mind racing. He had always thought that demanding respect was the only way to build strong fighters, but now, seeing the calm confidence Keanu exuded, he realized how misguided he had been. Riker's fighters had learned to fear him, to fight because they were pushed to, not because they understood the purpose of what they were doing. They didn't trust themselves. They trusted Riker's command, and that had been his failure. Keanu continued, his words cutting through Riker's internal struggle. You've been teaching out of ego, out of the need to prove something. But a teacher's true strength lies in their ability to guide, to build up their students, not break them down. If you want to earn their respect, you have to show them that you respect them first. Riker swallowed hard, his throat tight. I don't know if I can change all of that, he admitted, his voice rough. I don't know if I can be the kind of teacher you're asking me to be. Keanu turned to face him, his expression steady and reassuring. You can. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. Every day you'll have the chance to choose a different path. But it's going to take effort. It's going to take vulnerability. And it's going to take humility. Riker stood silently, absorbing Keanu's words. He had spent so many years locked in his own rigid beliefs, certain that his methods were the only way. The thought of changing them, of admitting that he had been wrong, was uncomfortable. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized Keanu was right. His students hadn't respected him. They had feared him. And fear could never build true strength. Keanu gave Riker a moment to reflect, his calm presence unwavering. He knew that change didn't happen in an instant. It happened in small, deliberate steps. The gym, the students, and Riker himself needed time to shift from the old ways of intimidation to a new philosophy of respect and understanding. I've seen your students, Riker, Keanu said softly, his gaze steady. They're capable, but they're carrying the weight of fear. You can change that, but it starts with you. You have to show them that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay to learn without fear of failure. Riker nodded slowly, his mind processing the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just changing how he taught, he was changing how he saw his students, how he interacted with them. He had been blind to their struggles, their fears. He had never seen them as individuals. They had always been just tools for him to shape into fighters. Keanu continued, his voice warm but firm. The best teachers are the ones who empower their students. They show them that they have the strength to overcome challenges on their own. Your job isn't to be their opponent, it's to help them become their best selves. Riker exhaled, feeling the weight of the lesson settle in. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. He didn't need to be the strongest, the toughest, the most dominant. He just needed to be a better version of himself, a version that guided his students with respect, patience, and understanding. I'll try, Riker said, his voice steady but with an openness that hadn't been there before. I'll work on it, one day at a time. Keanu offered him a small, understanding smile. That's all anyone can do, Riker. Take it one step at a time. And know that you're not alone in this. We all have room to grow. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the gym began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. What had once been a space filled with tension and fear now felt calmer, more focused. There was an air of respect that hadn't been there before. The students were no longer afraid to make mistakes or ask questions. They had begun to realize that growth didn't come from intimidation or force, but from understanding and patience. Riker's transformation as a coach was perhaps the most noticeable change. He had started to move away from his old methods, where yelling and physical dominance were the tools of his trade, and embraced a new approach. He encouraged the students to find their own rhythm, to focus on their form, and to treat each other as partners rather than opponents. Riker had become a more thoughtful teacher, listening more than he spoke, observing how his students responded to different techniques, and offering guidance without the harshness that had once defined his style. Ethan, too, had changed. He no longer walked into the gym with the burden of having to prove himself. The weight of being Keanu Reeves' son had lifted, and Ethan had finally found his own identity in the gym. He wasn't defined by his father's fame, but by his actions, his growth, and the respect he showed to others. As Ethan trained, his movements became more fluid, more confident. He wasn't trying to imitate anyone anymore. He was simply being himself. One afternoon, as Ethan worked through a drill with a partner, Riker observed from the side of the room. There was no longer the same critical edge in his gaze. He watched Ethan with a sense of pride, recognizing the strength in his quiet confidence. Ethan had become a symbol of what the gym was evolving into, a place where respect, not fear, shaped the students into better martial artists and better people. Keanu had returned to the gym a few times, quietly observing his son's progress. Each time, he saw the changes in the gym's atmosphere. The students greeted him with a warm, genuine respect, not because of his fame, but because of the principles he had demonstrated. It was clear that Keanu's presence had done more than just teach Ethan. It had set the tone for everyone in the gym. As the weeks went by, the changes in the gym became more noticeable. Students, once hesitant and fearful of making mistakes, now approached their training with a new attitude. They spoke to each other with respect, offering encouragement when someone struggled. It wasn't just about the techniques anymore, it was about the journey. They were learning to push themselves, not because they were afraid of failing, but because they believed in their own growth. Riker's approach to teaching had completely shifted. No longer the tyrant who ruled by intimidation, he had become a mentor who believed in the power of balance and respect. Instead of dictating every move, Riker now guided his students, giving them the space to explore the techniques on their own. He trusted them to make their own decisions and encouraged them to learn from each other. The atmosphere in the gym was no longer that of a place where people came to prove themselves, but a space where they came to learn and support one another. Riker no longer felt the need to assert his authority through loud commands and aggressive demonstrations. Instead, he observed, offering corrections with quiet authority and respect for the students' efforts. He began to notice the difference in their responses. They were more engaged, more willing to listen, and more eager to improve. Ethan's own growth during this period was remarkable. He had come into the gym with a sense of uncertainty, always trying to measure up to expectations that were placed on him because of who his father was. But now, that weight had lifted. He no longer saw himself as just Keanu Reeves' son. He saw himself as an individual, capable of making his own decisions and shaping his own future. In one of the training sessions, Ethan found himself working alongside some of the more experienced fighters. As they sparred, Ethan wasn't the one who struggled to keep up anymore. He was calm, precise, and fully engaged. His movements had become more fluid, more confident, and it wasn't just because of his training. It was because he had started to believe in himself. Keanu, who had been observing from the sidelines, smiled to himself. He had always known that Ethan had it in him, but seeing his son stand on his own 2 feet, no longer burdened by the expectations of others, made him proud in a way that words couldn't capture. The gym had changed, and with it, Ethan had changed too. By the end of the month, the gym had undergone a full transformation. The students no longer trained out of fear of punishment or ridicule. They trained because they respected the art, respected themselves, and respected one another. Even the most hardened fighters, who had once scoffed at the idea of gentleness in martial arts, had started to see the value in the approach Keanu and Riker had introduced. Ethan, who had once felt out of place in the gym, was now at ease. He had found his rhythm. He was no longer trying to imitate anyone or live up to the standards others had set for him. He trained because he wanted to, because it felt good to move with purpose, to push himself not out of fear, but out of a desire to improve. His confidence had grown as much as his physical skills. One afternoon, as the class finished its drills, Riker gathered everyone together. His usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful, humble demeanor. He addressed the class, his voice steady and sincere. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my teaching," Riker began, his eyes scanning the room, meeting each student's gaze. "I've let my ego get in the way of what really matters. But we're here to learn, and I've learned just as much from all of you as I've tried to teach you. Thank you for sticking with me, and thank you for being patient." The students, who had once feared Riker's wrath, now looked at him with respect. They knew that Riker wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that effort spoke volumes. He wasn't just trying to create fighters anymore, he was trying to create better people. Ethan felt a sense of peace as he watched Riker speak. This was the man who had once made him feel inferior, who had treated him like a tool to be shaped, not an individual. Now, Riker was showing humility, showing that true strength didn't come from tearing others down, but from lifting them up. Ethan had learned that lesson too, not just from Keanu, but from watching the transformation of the gym and its people. Keanu, who had been quietly observing the class, turned to Ethan with a proud smile. Ethan smiled back, the weight of the past no longer hanging over him. He had found his place, not because of who his father was, but because of the strength he had found within himself. The gym, once a place of tension and fear, had become a sanctuary of growth, respect, and collaboration. The journey had just begun, but for the first time, Ethan and the others knew that they were on the right path. The gym had emptied out after another successful session, the sounds of feet shuffling and gear being packed away, now replaced with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. The atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the tension that once dominated this space. Students exchanged smiles, spoke with each other with respect, and went about their day in a much more peaceful manner than ever before. Keanu and Ethan stood at the door, ready to leave. Keanu placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his gaze softening as he looked at his son. Ethan had come a long way, not just physically, but emotionally. The quiet, confident young man standing beside him was no longer burdened by the weight of his father's name, but proud of the person he was becoming. "You did well today," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady but filled with pride. Ethan smiled up at his father, the weight of the past few weeks finally settling in. "Thanks, Dad. I feel like I'm really starting to get it, not just the techniques, but the whole point of it all." Keanu nodded, understanding. "That's the key, Ethan. Martial arts isn't about fighting. It's about growing as a person. It teaches us patience, discipline, and how to handle ourselves in situations where others might lose control. But the most important thing it teaches is how to understand others and yourself." Ethan thought about this as they walked out of the gym together. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the parking lot. The cool evening air felt refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt at peace with himself. He had struggled with the expectations placed on him because of who his father was, but now he saw that martial arts was about something deeper. It was about understanding the balance between strength and calm, aggression and patience. As they walked toward the car, Ethan turned to Keanu. "You know, for the longest time, I thought I had to prove something. Like I had to show everyone that I could be a fighter, just like you. But I get it now. It's not about that. It's about control. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Keanu smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. That's exactly it. True strength doesn't come from overpowering others. It comes from mastering yourself, your emotions, and knowing what truly matters. They reached the car and Keanu opened the door for Ethan, watching him as he slid into the seat. Ethan had come a long way, and Keanu was proud of him. But more importantly, Ethan had learned the most valuable lesson of all. The lesson that martial arts wasn't just about winning in a ring. It was about winning in life, in understanding who you are and what you stand for. As Keanu and Ethan drove through the quiet streets, the weight of the day seemed to lift with every passing mile. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a peaceful end to a transformative day, and Keanu felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his son had taken a monumental step toward understanding not just martial arts, but life itself. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the kind of peace that only comes after a hard day's work. Keanu stole a glance at Ethan as he drove, seeing the subtle change in him. The confidence in his son's demeanor wasn't the kind that came from showing off or bragging. It was the kind that came from true understanding. Ethan wasn't looking for validation from anyone else anymore. He was content in knowing that his actions, both inside and outside the gym, spoke for themselves. After a moment, Keanu broke the silence. "You've come a long way, son," he said, his voice soft but full of meaning. "When you first started, you were always looking to prove something. I see now that you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've found your own strength." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, still processing everything he had learned over the past few weeks. "I used to think that being strong meant being the best, fighting the hardest, but now I see that strength is about something more. It's about controlling yourself, staying calm, and knowing when to fight." Keanu smiled. "Exactly. And that's the true power of martial arts. It teaches you balance. Balance between strength and softness, between action and stillness. You don't need to force your way through life, Ethan. You've learned that sometimes the strongest move is to walk away." Ethan's expression softened as he reflected on his father's words. He had always admired Keanu, but now, more than ever, he understood the depth of his father's wisdom. It wasn't about being a famous actor or a world-renowned martial artist. It was about being a man of integrity, humility, and self-awareness. As the car slowed to a stop in front of their house, Keanu turned to Ethan one last time. "Martial arts isn't just about fighting in a ring, son. It's about the fight we have every day within ourselves. Keep that in mind as you continue your journey." The car came to a stop, and the quiet of the evening was punctuated only by the sound of the engine idling. Keanu and Ethan sat for a moment, both lost in thought, reflecting on the lessons they had learned and shared. The street lights cast a warm glow on the pavement, and the world around them seemed to have paused for a moment of peaceful reflection. Keanu turned to Ethan, his voice steady and calm. "I'm proud of you, son. The journey you've been on isn't just about martial arts. It's about becoming the person you were meant to be. You've taken control of your path, and that's the most important thing." Ethan smiled softly, his mind filled with the wisdom his father had imparted. "Thanks, Dad. I never realized how much of this was about myself, about understanding who I am and what I stand for. It's not just about being strong, but knowing why I fight and when not to fight." Keanu nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "That's the essence of martial arts, and that's the essence of life. You can't fight every battle. You need to know when to step back, when to stay calm, and when to use your strength wisely." As they stepped out of the car and walked into their home, the warmth of the evening seemed to settle around them. The lessons of the day, the transformation of the gym, and the journey Ethan had made were all part of something bigger. something that would continue to shape both of their lives. Keanu looked at his son one last time before they entered the house. "Remember, Ethan, true strength doesn't come from showing how tough you are. It comes from the peace you find within yourself." With that final piece of wisdom, they stepped into the quiet of their home, ready for the next chapter in their journey together.